We are just delighted to welcome you all to this event tonight. We've had an incredible number of registrations, over 900 registrations for this event, so many that we had to close the registrations today, so apologies if your colleagues have missed out. We have representatives from every state and territory in Australia, from Port Pirie to Bourke, as well as educators from over 25 different countries. So we encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat box and find out where others are from. My name is Susanna Schofel. I'm the Associate Director at Evidence for Learning, and I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Dr. Tanya Vaughan, Professor Anne Castles, and Jenny McKay, who we'll introduce to you shortly. Dr. Pauline Ho, also from our team, is here and will be monitoring the chat box to answer any questions that you have. Tonight's conversation will be about exploring evidence-informed literacy approaches and those that are particularly relevant to you as primary school educators and as primary teachers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I am sitting on Wurundjeri land, people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to extend that respect to the elders past, present and emerging of the lands on which you're joining us from also, and anyone who is joining us tonight too. We're going to share a brief overview of the research and evidence that exists in this space around literacy, particularly primary literacy, and how that evidence base has been translated into practical recommendations for schools. We're then going to invite our panelists to join in a discussion facilitated by Tanya Vaughan, and we'll ask them to share their very unique perspectives on both the academic and the practical aspects of literacy in primary schools. One thing that I should mention is that if you are looking for a certificate of attendance tonight, you can email info@evidenceforlearning.com and one will be sent to you. Evidence for Learning, our team have a commitment to sharing the evidence of what works and what doesn't work as well in practical ways which can help school leaders and teachers make informed decisions. Our two most recent contributions to this space are our guidance reports on improving literacy in primary, the lower primary report, which looks at ages 5 to 7, and then the upper primary, which has a focus on ages 7 to 11. Each guidance report contains a set of practical recommendations, which we'll walk through with you tonight. They build on the work of the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK and draw from literacy approaches in our Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which we'll show you also. These documents are written primarily for school leaders, and they aren't intended to be a comprehensive list of everything that could work, but they recommend or they represent these key levers that have been shown to be successful in improving literacy. As part of building these for an Australian audience, we worked with Anne's team at Macquarie University Centre for Reading, and we're incredibly grateful for their guidance and their advice in helping us contextualise this for an Australian audience. These two reports for us add to a growing resource base, and we're pleased at the moment to be working on a report for secondary literacy, which we'll share with you in about 6 weeks' time. As I mentioned, the guidance reports build on a lot of the evidence that exists within our Teaching and Learning Toolkit, and that work is led by Tanya Vaughan, who you're going to hear from tonight. The toolkit summarises approaches around 35 different approaches in schools. It summarises the global evidence on each of those approaches, and which around 10,000 studies feed into that synthesis. The three approaches which directly relate to literacy are up on your screen at the moment. They're outlined for you. And we encourage you to dive into the toolkit itself, because this only really offers you a snapshot of the sort of high level introduction to these resources. But the three that are here for you as literacy resources and that we'll also touch on tonight are oral language interventions, which emphasise the importance of spoken language, verbal interaction in the classrooms, things like targeted reading aloud, the use of structured questioning, phonics, the approach to teaching reading and some aspects of writing by developing learners' phonemic awareness, and then of course reading comprehension strategies which focus on learners' understanding of text. that help them enable comprehension of meaning in what they're reading, inferring meaning from context, summarising key points, using graphic organisers and things to that extent. What we can observe from the three approaches that you can see on the screen is that they're quite similar when we look at them through the lenses of cost, evidence security, and months of impact. A very low average cost, this equates to less than $160 per student per year. A very strong evidence security rating, and in fact phonics is the only approach within the toolkit that has a 5 padlock rating, which we see as a very extensive evidence base. And the three approaches consistently show a positive impact on student achievement, upwards of 4 months additional progress to what we would see had these not been in place. So please dive into the toolkit. You'll find really clear descriptions of each approach. You'll find details about the research that underpins the approach, considerations for practice, and explanations that talk to those three indicators of cost, evidence security, and impact. And the last thing I want to share with you are the recommendations from the reports themselves. So you'll see that we've got 8 recommendations for lower primary and 7 recommendations for upper primary. They're thematically arranged into speaking and listening, reading, writing, assessment and diagnosis, and targeted interventions. And terrific to have your pre-assigned questions for this webinar, as lots of them fell into these groupings here. These 5 themes exist for both the lower and upper primary setting, and there's commonalities across both. So actually the upper primary often are just a slightly more sophisticated piece of work that builds on those foundations of lower primary. The key message for leaders and teachers really is that these recommendations shouldn't be used in isolation. They are part of a whole rich literature strategy for a school. And so they intertwine and they impact each other. These reports are now available on our website. They've just been released, and we encourage you to explore them, to also reach out to us and provide feedback. And our panel will touch on the practicalities of a number of these recommendations. And so with no further delay, I am going to introduce you to our facilitator for tonight's discussion, Dr. Tanya Vaughan, my colleague at Evidence for Learning. Tanya is the Associate Director, and she's responsible for product development, community leadership, and the strategy of the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which I'd spoken about earlier. She's worked in policy design, in implementation and evaluation across a number of key Australian organisations. She's consulted on international and national projects in leadership and education and evaluation. And she was the lead investigator on impact in programs in the arts for outcomes on students who are highly disadvantaged, which resulted in a book for international readers. I'm going to invite Tanya now to introduce our panelists this evening. I'm going to disappear into the back end of this system and help to answer questions in the chat box. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you have, and we'll try to get to them. But thank you, Tanya. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. A warm welcome to you all tonight, and thank you for joining us from across the world. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce the panelists that we have here tonight. Such a delight to have them on board to be speaking in such areas that they're such distinguished educators and academics of. So firstly, I'll introduce Professor Anne Castles, and she's the Distinguished Professor of Cognitive Science at Macquarie University and also the Scientific Director at Macquarie University Centre for Reading. Her research really focuses in on learning to read, and in particular, the processes by which children become skilled word readers. She has a keen interest in variability within the reading impaired population and the causes of different reading disorders, including cognitive, genetic, and also language factors. She has published over 100, which is a remarkable feat, research papers, and has given numerous keynote presentations across the world. She's also served as the President of Learning Difficulties Australia from 2017 to 2018. So a very warm welcome to you tonight, Anne.
Hi everybody, and thanks so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Great to have you here, Anne. Now, next up is Jenny McKay. Jenny McKay is the Deputy Principal at Dandenong North Primary School. At her time at Dandenong North, she has led incredible student improvements through an unwavering focus on literacy. And this has been driven by a keen focus on both the academic research and then also what really works within the context of Dandenong North for her students. Her emphasis on the development of staff and the focus on meeting individual students' needs has given and produced many years of growth and achievement for so many students in need. Jenny is incredibly generous in sharing her knowledge with those within her local region of Dandenong and then those much further afield. Jenny, it's such a pleasure to have you here tonight.
Thanks, Tanya, and I'm really pleased also to be here. And welcome to everybody in the audience.
Thank you. Now, we're going to start off. So I would like to hear a little bit of background from you, Jenny, and from Anne as well. Just a little bit of background more to your context. I'll start off with Anne. So Anne, at the Macquarie University Centre for Reading that was launched last year, can you tell us a little bit about what is the actual focus of the centre and what do the researchers work on in there?
Yeah, I mean, we're incredibly fortunate at Macquarie that we have, I would say, arguably the largest number of reading researchers virtually in the world at a single university. That's sort of developed over a period of years as we've built a reputation in this field. And so our attempt last year was to bring this all together into a much more sort of coherent body, which is, as you mentioned, the Macquarie Centre for Reading. And so that includes more than 25 active researchers from across a range of different departments as well. So we have people in psychology, people in cognitive science, where I am, but also people in education and linguistics. So we get that really sort of interdisciplinary understanding of the complexity of acquiring literacy across our research. And look, our research covers sort of the whole gamut, like learning to read, how skilled reading works, writing and spelling, very complex problem that we probably don't know enough about, as well as you mentioned, reading difficulties and how to help with those. But a really key part of the centre is we have the research, but also a key part of the centre's aims is to assist in translation into practice, which is part of the reason I'm here tonight. So what we really want to do is be able to be right there to push that research out and get it to the places and to people like Jenny who can really do something important with it. And built into the centre as well, we have the Macquarie University Reading Clinic, which is a dedicated clinic looking at literacy and which is a not-for-profit that sees children with various kinds of reading and spelling problems. So I guess we're trying to be the sort of one-stop shop of literacy. Any questions you have, come to us.
That is so exciting to be surrounded by so many researchers working across so many diverse fields, all focused in on literacy. You must love coming to work. That's fantastic. Thank you, Anne. every second day at least.
Yeah,
Jenny, fantastic to have you here. Now, we know that Dandenong North Primary School has had a really clear and consistent focus on literacy and has done so for many years. Can you share some of the context within your community and why you've made literacy such a key focus?
Yeah, well, Dandenong is one of the most disadvantaged community or municipalities within Australia. And we're a large school of 800, but 90% of that student population come from EAL backgrounds. And to add to that level of complexity, the majority of the children come as refugees. So their parents have fled areas of conflict across the world. As a consequence, they have perhaps not had any schooling before or severely disrupted schooling. So when they arrive with us, there are multiple layers of complexity that we have to address. One of the main issues that we had was obviously to have them speaking English proficiently so that they could access the mainstream curriculum. So we have a sense of urgency about what we have to do. We are seen, I think, by the parents as being the one hope. They arrive in Australia going, we're not in a position to be able to help our children, so we're their best hope. And if we don't do it right, then their future education is severely impacted. So that's really what drives us to do the best job we can. And literacy, when we looked at what we really needed to focus on, we wanted to focus on what matters most, and that came down to literacy. Because if you've come to a new country and you can't speak the language, you can't communicate, you're powerless to really participate in that community. So that's really where we started looking years ago. We were a failing school. We've looked at research over the years. We try to keep current in what's coming out. And we try to look at our own context and apply what we think will work best in our situation. So we're fortunate in having a family community who values education. They see education as the way forward for their whole family well-being and the future of the family. And the joy for our teachers is that attitude towards education comes across in our students. They are really enthusiastic. They want to learn. What do I have to do next? How long will it take me to get to, this part? When can I perhaps leave the EAL program and join in? So we've got a wonderful staff. We've got a wonderful community and wonderful students. So it's a gift, really, coming to work.
Thank you, Jenny. That was so beautiful and just wonderful to hear of the progress that you've been able to make, really, with that unrelenting focus on research and then turning that research into practice in your setting to help, some of the most disadvantaged population across Australia. So that's very inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing that context. So we know now a broader question on looking at literacy. And first I'll turn to Anne and then I'll turn to you, Jenny. We know that much of the evidence around literacy is focused on different age groups or found to be more effective at different stages in the development of literacy skills. So we know that a strong foundation in literacy, and you were just talking about this, is really a foundation for all learning, as Jenny was just saying. And we know that oral language can be particularly a key component of this. So, Anne, it's a massive field. You've contributed over 100 papers. I keep saying that because it is incredibly impressive. If anyone has ever written a peer-reviewed publication, just to say 100. Whew. All right, so it's a big field of research. But are there approaches that you've come across that appear to have, the greatest impact for students that you can tell us about here tonight, Anne?
Yeah, well, as it is a massive field, and it's impossible even for us working in research to keep on top of it all, let alone people out there, involved in actual teaching practice. But look, I think, those three basic things that were summarized on that slide are probably a pretty good place to start in terms of picking where you're really getting the maximum, I guess, bang for your buck. And, I think when we think about, I don't necessarily want to think so much about ages, but more about making sure the child gets the foundational building blocks that they need to then be able to get to the next point. And as has been, of course, discussed at length in various, venues and contexts recently, it's very clear that very basic foundational teaching of phonics is really just essential. And the reason that it's essential is because it gets the child off the starting blocks. So they learn about letters, they learn about how letters make up our writing system, and then they learn about how those letters are a code for sound. And there's so much research to show that that is children's hook into the language system, because they can then match what they see with sound. Now, of course, down the track, they're doing something much more complex than that. They're reading for meaning, and it's done in a much more automatic way. But if you give children that initial hook in to being able to get to the sounds, what they can do is they can start to be able to read for themselves, and they can match what they're reading onto the oral language that they have. So giving children that just basic foundation. The other thing about it is that it's difficult to teach, but it's a relatively constrained body of knowledge that you're teaching the children. There's only so many letters and sounds that have to be learned. And so by teaching children this fairly constrained body of knowledge, you open up an absolute world of literacy to them. And of course, what you want to be happening as quickly as possible is to get them to be able to read independently for themselves. And that initial foundation in phonics gets them on the starting blocks. It certainly doesn't get them all the way in reading, but it gets them on the starting blocks. And then, as has been alluded to, there's the much richer and more complex and important process of building oral language and the kind of rich vocabulary that allow children to then get the most out of what they're reading when they do read it. And that's something that is not so much foundational, but something that needs to stretch all the way through the instructional process, all the way through primary school.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Anne. And I think a really good point that you raised there was that rather than thinking about age dependency, is really focusing on where that child is particularly. And that, I know, Jenny, has been a real focus at your school at Dandenong North Primary School. And do you want to talk us through how you've made that, rather the where is the child at? What's the capacity of the child at the moment? How have you made that the key driver to any interventions that you introduce or work with children at that particular place where they are at?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we have children coming in maybe in year 6 that have never attended school, and they come from a language background where the phonemes of the English language don't even exist. So like Anne was talking about, phonemes and phonics become important. So what we have to do is make sure that we can accelerate the children's understanding of English and the structures of English, the writing, the reading. So to be able to do that, we have to make sure that they have very explicit and intense instruction that's going to speed up that learning, so that they, as I mentioned earlier, so they can access the mainstream curriculum. So we do have a range of intervention programs depending on what the needs of the child are. And the reason being is we've actually made a decision to put some of our most experienced and highly effective teachers leading those intervention programs, so that the quality of instruction the children get, we know, is going to be as good as we can offer. And they use an explicit instructional model. We make sure that the learning in all of those programs is highly scaffolded, so that we can track quite closely the progress the children are making, where there might be gaps. We make sure that the teachers in the classroom are outstanding, but we do have a lot of graduates that come through such a large school. So we want to make sure that the children who are our most vulnerable learners are actually accessing experience, and the teachers that take those interventions know how to sort of dig deeper, or how to take the child back to where their learning is. And that's been really effective for us. It's not to say that we focus heavily on literacy within the classroom, and we've got some fantastic explicit programs. One of the best programs I think we've ever introduced that covers all of the areas that it's talking about in the research is the Talk for Writing program. Focuses on oral language, it focuses on vocabulary development, the oral comprehension that children require embedding the syntax of English, which is incredibly difficult to embed in children from a non-English speaking background. So that's probably why we have our interventions. The children are only in for a short time, or as short as possible. It's not a program, they're not programs where we have children just lingering for year after year because, you know, oh, they've got an EAL background. We stage that. They've got to be in and out pretty much within a certain time, or we start to look for other issues that may be preventing their learning at the average rate that we've sort of worked out that they should progress through the stages. Similarly with our speech therapy assistant program, we make sure that they're involved in that if we think there's an expressive or receptive language issue. Our reading we call it a reading factory because we've got such a lockstep program that's way of describing the scaffolding that they're in and out within a few terms. We hope to get them up to the benchmark, and that's the aim. We want them in the classroom, but we will be really quick and efficient in getting them up to the right level.
That's really exciting. So it's really about tracking the individual needs of the student in a real-time basis and having them progress through the necessary interventions that exist. And you have a wide variety of those, and also how is the capacity of new teachers, you've mentioned this, how is the capacity of new teachers supported at Dandenong?
Well, we have an acronym that describes it called IMO-CAD. So we have a 2-year induction program that they go through the IMO-CAD for 2 years, so that it's not just a 12-month process. They have a different mentor for both of those years that focus on different elements of their development, and it's very personalised. We have mentors for them where they change, you know, they do change over. We have a coaching program, so they understand how their discussion and their self-reflections should sort of the track that they should follow. Observation is a huge element, so that we expect that all our new teachers, whether they're graduates or they've come in from another school, that they do a range of observations so they can actually see what best practice looks like at our school. We encourage them to go to the intervention so that they understand the work that these teachers are doing, as the intervention teachers will observe them so that they understand what's required in that classroom for a child to work independently. We give them a lot of professional development. That's a huge element of IMO-CAD, and appraisals are common and regular process for them. So, you know, over the 2-year process time period, it's fairly intensive upskilling of those teachers to the Dandenong North Way, we say, you know, of explicit teaching. And we have a very explicit teaching and learning model so that the lessons are consistent. If somebody's coming in to watch, they understand how that lesson's been scaffolded. Teachers are free to put their individual mark and approach, but we actually know how the lesson's structured. And what that's done is actually raise the profile of graduate and new teachers, because with people observing each other, you get a great sense of collective efficacy forming within your staff, so that if you're sending your children to this teacher, you're trusting that they're going to do the best possible job and probably better than you. And likewise, coming back from the intervention teachers, they're going, you know what, they're really following the advice we've given them. So it does work very well for us.
And if I can just jump in,
please do.
In there from the research point of view, that everything you're saying there, Jenny, is just so consistent with what the research suggests in terms of what produces overall the best outcomes, and that's that focus on explicitness, consistency, you know, and systematicity across the whole school. I think what we see a lot is absolutely fantastic work and interventions and programs by individual teachers or individual school levels, but then not necessarily always carried through consistently at the school level. And it's when you get that whole school, everybody signing on, and as Jenny says, everyone being trained up to be an expert literacy instructor, which is a very hard thing to do, that's when you really see these big shifts.
Well, it's taken the fear away, Anne, of a new teacher or a young teacher thinking that they're not up to scratch. What we've found by running through this program that we developed is that they're so willing to go, tell me what I've got to do. What do I have to improve on? You don't have to tiptoe around it. They just go, I want to be like this teacher. What do I have to do? Tell me. What am I doing that I've got to tweak? It's been a really successful approach for us.
And I should emphasise,
go ahead.
Then I'll let you speak.
No.
And I should emphasise that doesn't necessarily mean, it can do, but doesn't necessarily mean adopting a single off-the-shelf program or anything like that. You can be systematic and consistent using methods that you're developing entirely within the school.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. And I think what got me so excited, both Jenny and there, was really talking about the systemisation across the school and also the deprivatization of practice. So teachers being willing to observe each other. You know, I still am a registered teacher. It's fantastic that you've developed the culture up to the point, Jenny, that the teachers are asking directly for feedback and instruction from their more knowledgeable peers. I mean, really, it's Vygotsky for adults, which we should all be engaged in. And that was my poor attempt at a joke. I can hear the laughter echoing throughout the halls. Now, what we really, Jenny, you really covered there, I think, really well your approach to looking at students with additional needs and meeting the student where they're at, with a range of pulling in a range of different resources within your school. I'd like to hear from Anne what the literature base says around that type of approach. So what's the best way to meet students with additional needs, and also those students, it's a really hard question, Anne, but you love hard questions, and those students that, you know, are maybe coming to the school overachieving, or those that are struggling with their literacy, what do you think is the very best, what does the literature tell us around that?
Yeah, thanks.
In a nutshell.
Look, you know, I would say the very first and most important thing here is assessment. You know, you've got to have good, well-targeted, easily administered assessment tools that you can use to track a child, you know, fairly consistently across a year, so you know immediately where they're at and what they need, and you know, more than just sort of, I think ideally more than just what reading level are they at, but you know, what you know, how well is their phonics developing, what is their oral language looking like, those kinds of, what's their reading comprehension looking like. And then, you know, then the question of how you then deal with those differences in the classroom becomes somewhat easier. I still would never say it's easy, because I can well imagine, I can't imagine how teachers with such a wide range of abilities, you know, within a single class manage to deal with that. But certainly that provides you with the roadmap to then be, you know, there's no point teaching a child higher level comprehension strategies if they're still not you know, consistently decoding. So you've been giving that child different work, whereas, and as you say, and I'm often asked about this, there are those children, it's not a huge proportion of them, but maybe 5%, who walk in kindergarten and can already pretty much read what they want. And so clearly you'd be doing different things with those children. You wouldn't be spending too much time. You'd be checking they'd got those basic foundational skills and then moving them on to other, you know, more language and comprehension based reading activities.
Fantastic. And just in case within the audience, I know we'll have a range of knowledge base with the terminology of decoding. How would you describe that?
I'd be referring there largely, it's a very good point, because that term gets used in a whole range of different ways. I'd be referring largely to phonic decoding. That's the most typical use of the term. So do they know the major letter sound correspondences such that they can take a word or a new word that they haven't seen before and they can sound it out. We also mean there, to some extent, word reading fluency. So are they also able to fairly rapidly recognise a large number of words in the kinds of texts that they'd be reading? Because the important thing about that is if they have moved to that level of automaticity, it means that they're able to read the words fairly straightforwardly, and so they're freed up to be able to focus on thinking about the meaning and you know, making inferences and those other much more high level things. So we'd want to be looking at word reading fluency as well as phonic skills.
I love that description there where you say that once they have those basic skills, so in the decoding and also within the fluency, well, then they can really, I think, engage. I'm a great lover of literacy, so I imagine the joy of engaging with a wonderful text. Yeah. And that can only really come once we've got those skills established. I guess for you, Jenny, from a practical perspective, how are those areas that Anne's talking about there a key focus of your literacy program within your school?
Yeah, very much. I love that Anne focused first of all on data, because if you don't understand where your students' strengths and weaknesses are, you can't start to develop a program for them. So the data is really crucial. And I think the explicit instruction model that we have actually allows us to monitor students far more frequently, looking at what they're learning, what do we have to go back over. I think that that's a really important element. Know your students and know where they are. I think that we have to have the understanding and the belief that all students can learn. And so it's up to us that we make sure that we come up with strategies that allow them to access their learning, you know, breaking it down, looking at those high impact teaching strategies where they're getting, you know, worked examples if they need that, if they're getting multiple exposures to something, they're getting lots of practice to do things. So I think that, you know, we've got to look as teachers at what strategies we have to use, as well as, you know, all what the research is telling us. That's with, you know, the research is coming up with so much information almost daily, and we've got this plethora of information. We've got to try and work out what's going to work best in our context and really try and make the most of it. I think the consistent approach that we need to have in schools allows us and the children to actually understand how the work will be presented. They know what's required of them. It actually liberates them to some extent to be more independent learners. I love all the work that's been done around phonics, because I think, you know, that's the key to it. I strongly believe oral language is really key to all students, and that we need to give our children who have learning difficulties as well as a learning disability optimum opportunities to practice oral language. Our program in Talk for Writing and Talk for Reading, which is starting now, allows that. It gives them fantastic practice time. I think that we've got to be very purposeful in how we present our oral language. It's not just the fact that the children are nodding their head because we think they understand. I think we've got to really focus on vocabulary development, because if they don't have a wide vocabulary, how are they going to have high-level comprehension when they start to read? How do they fully express themselves, and so that, you know, that they can present the best view forward if they're required to do that in many situations in writing? So that's probably, I'm hoping, has answered that question. I think
definitely.
Yeah, and
that's
I think
exactly
that, you know,
right. Sorry.
We need to also be fairly cognizant of the fact that these children need to have individualised plans, and are we sticking with them, and are we providing children with effective feedback? I think that's a really low cost strategy that teachers can use for all children, but particularly children with learning difficulties, that instead of waiting till the next lesson and the work, you know, has been corrected, that we give purposeful next step learning within the lesson. And you've already adjusted that learning plan on the spot. And I think that's a strategy that our teachers have developed really well over the last 5 or so years.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jenny. Now, Anne, I think Anne had a point there as well.
I was really just going to agree again, furiously.
Good.
with Jenny in terms of the importance of oral language, and there is research out there that's demonstrated that, you know, oral language interventions do benefit reading comprehension down the track. So we've clearly shown that. And I think it's also important, you know, there's a term in the reading literature called the Matthew effect, and this reflects the fact that, you know, kids who struggle with those initial stages of reading, they kind of get a double whammy because they're having trouble reading. So as a result of that, they're getting less exposure to language and meaning and nuance as they would as compared to another child who's gone ahead in reading. So you get a kind of a snowball effect where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, which is why it's so important, as Jenny says, for those kids that perhaps are struggling with that initial, you know, getting that fluency in word reading, to be making sure that you're building up their oral language, both through oral conversation, but also reading to them.
Yeah.
So there's also a lot of research to suggest that the kind of language in books is quite different from the kind of language we use when we talk to each other in conversation. It tends to be much richer in its syntax and its the breadth of the vocabulary. So doing that, giving those children so much opportunity to be read to, or to read to each other in groups, those kinds of things, very valuable.
Yeah, and also we find that a lot more focus on oral questioning within the reading lesson is having a huge effect, because we've got children turning to a partner and talking. We've got then they might turn to another pair. So they're getting that practice of expressing their ideas succinctly. They're learning from their peers, which we know is a great strategy for children learning from each other. They're learning and being able to reinforce new vocabulary that they've come across. So I don't think I appreciated till I started reading the research on the power of oral language, and making sure that we are purposeful in the way that we structure our oral language opportunities within the classroom.
That's very exciting. That's so exciting. I'm just thinking of myself as a kid in that classroom. I think I would have thrived in a high oral dialogue and someone encouraging me.
Well, we have
questions to my neighbours.
We have some beautiful good news stories from the clinic and from our years of research with kids with reading difficulties, because some of them come in with very strong oral language, quite a few of them, and their struggle is just with some of those basic, basic reading components. And what you see, as they get over the barrier, the sky's the limit for them, and they're the one, they'll be the ones coming top of English in their HSC. Like it doesn't, having a difficulty with those foundational stages of learning to read does not have to be a barrier. You just have to get through it and then get that child to the other side.
That is such wonderful news in dark times, I think. And we're going to turn now to more of the reality of what's happening in the world at the moment. But I think to hear that and the importance of that, is what really evidence is all about. If we can use that evidence to help and try people overcome the struggles that they have in literacy, and then open up that wonderful world of reading and education, I mean, that's the key to overcoming disadvantage. And it's great to see you both so passionate on this topic. So if we're thinking, and this one, Jenny, I'm going to direct to you. So really in a practical context, and we all know we've got educators from across the world joining us tonight, the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact, and we know that there are predictions that this is going to increase the gap between those that are struggling with reading. We don't think that it's going to have a positive impact. I'd like to hear from you, Jenny, and we're in Victoria currently. You're based in Victoria. We've had one lockdown of home-supported learning. We're going into our second round of home-supported learning. I'd like to hear from you, like, what are some practical things that you learned from the first round, or how are you approaching the second round differently, or just, how are you approaching this time? Because I think it will be useful for educators across internationally and in Australia as well.
Well, I think every educator that's been in lockdown's probably rolling their eyes and giving big sighs at the moment. It's not an easy ride.
No, sorry,
and
I was
going
laughing
into a second wave and lockdown is just, incredibly disappointing.
It is.
Yeah, we took the approach of devices for our first lockdown. It was a huge task here. We had to hand out about 400 devices to, it was about half the population of the school and get that organised. It was a hard slog for the teachers. It was a hard slog for the parents and the children. We didn't realise really, we have a wonderful ICT program, but we thought we were doing wonderfully with things like coding and program design and all of that. And we had neglected to probably skill the children in things like how to respond to an email. Just really done that, so goodness, we've got to go back to basics. But overall, I think that this is where a lot of our graduate teachers shone. It was a wonderful opportunity for them to come in and really show us how best we can use technology. Our children really did need to have that connection over the internet, over the computers. And I remember for our vulnerable children that came into school, I walked into the rooms that they were learning in, and I said, why do you have the headphones on? You don't need that for what you're doing. What's the reason? They go, I just keep replaying my teacher's voice. It just makes me feel safe. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's just, you just don't realise sometimes what a big role our teachers play in children's just sense of well-being. What we did was the teachers did an amazing job. I just can't thank them enough. They put on a lot of films with lessons, and they were contacting parents just every day, and the children, they were reading to the children, they were giving very explicit instruction. And the fact that we have a set model, the children understood how a lesson should go and what was expected of them. We did have trouble contacting some families, and on further investigation for some of our EAL students that really struggled, and of course their parents struggle with English, we then had to make the decision to go to paper packs because it wasn't working. There was stress in the family for a range of reasons beyond COVID, and this was just adding extra stress to them. So we sent out paper packs, and we got fantastic feedback from that. So currently we've started with paper packs, and we've bought some student commercially made workbooks, because my concern was that the teachers were working so hard. When we returned to school, it was like the Walking Dead. They were exhausted, and by the end of term, I was really concerned for many of them. They just hadn't recovered from, and then of course the hard work of trying to catch them up. That wasn't as hard as we thought it would be. The intervention programs and our way of being able to track children with their learning and picking up where we know they're at actually was really wonderful. We're actually going to have to go back to the remote learning with devices. We've got our tech currently working on getting those 400 laptops and iPads back re-imaged. But, we've tried different things. We've got some things for some children, a different approach for others, and we'll just do what it takes to work. But thank goodness for some of these wonderful apps. We're using Seesaw, and that's alleviating a lot of our parents' worries, because they have got instant access. Having said that, we're telling teachers they've got to knock off at a certain time this time.
Good on you. Good on you. You have to look after your teachers.
Yeah.
They work so hard.
Oh, they're gold. Honestly.
They are gold.
Yeah.
They're gold. And thanks to really, you're echoing probably the comments that would be made from thousands of principals from across the world, is that, well done to teachers, well done to yourself, Jenny, as a leader, in these really difficult times, in putting your students first and making, such big, increased sacrifices and time in to help reach them and responding so dynamically. And I think hats off to the profession in this phase. So we've covered a great breadth of topics here tonight, and now I've got one final question, and we know that really there's no silver bullet for literacy, but I was wondering if you could both make a closing remark, and I'll start with Anne and then I'll hand to Jenny, about, from your own experience, about something that you've seen that could work to improve students' learning. And this is a really big question, but I'm asking you to do it quickly, and I'm sure you can.
Well, I think in some ways we have probably covered it. I mean, I would sum it up as words. Get children reading words. You know, I know words are only a part of written language, but there's so much research to suggest that if you have a child who is struggling with reading, very often almost always you can find a problem at the word level, that being either their phonics or their fluency in reading words. And so if you can get that happening, then the task is to move on to the much more complex task of giving the child a rich language experience. And of course, that's something that has to play out, well, all the way up into high school and adulthood. Of course, we're all acquiring that all the time. But if you get those words in place and that fluency, the ability for children to read on their own, you free up their mental and cognitive space to allow them to do that other very complex learning.
I think that's a key point that you've made. Oh, sorry, Jenny, you jump in.
That's all right. Well, I don't have to mention what Anne said, so I get another go at another, bullet. I think explicit instruction really works in our environment. We've been fortunate enough to happen upon this program, Talk for Writing, that I've mentioned probably 4 or 5 times, but it's the best thing I've seen in terms of a pedagogy that really caters for the whole gamut of literacy, and it also caters for that whole range of abilities within a classroom. It's just something that I didn't think would be possible, but we are just getting the most amazing results from children that, perhaps couldn't speak a word of English 2 years ago, and their written work and their response to reading is just going through the roof at the moment. So, I would encourage people, you don't have to take it on, but have a look at it and see if that would be a fix for your school in addressing a wide range of literacy skills for your children.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jenny. What we can do, we can link out to that in our further reading links as well. And for everyone, first I'd like to just thank you both for just being absolutely remarkable tonight and bringing your depth and breadth of experience, both from and that really practical experience to the educators. I don't know if you were catching the comments as they were going, but I've seen a lot of expressions in absolute gratitude of the contributions that you've made to this panel tonight. And so we thank you so much for your time tonight. And we'll just close out with popping back to just having a look forward to some of the webinars that we have coming up. So these are the webinars that we have coming up in the next couple of weeks. So we'll be looking at collaboration, student learning, and then one that might be relevant for you to talk to your secondary peers in. I'm a secondary teacher, but don't judge me for that. I do have a primary son, so I have been teaching him, attempting and gaining a whole new respect for literacy learning during this home supported learning period, even as recent as this morning. So then we'll be having Mark Clutton and Dr. Kate De Bruyn join us from Monash University for a session on senior literacy. These are the different ways that you can get in touch with us. So that's my own and Susanna's email address. If you want a certificate of attendance, I saw people asking for that during the session. That's where you write it, info@evidenceforlearning.org.au. If you want to attend our other webinar series, that's where you go to. The slide deck will be sent out. The video recording will be sent out. And we're finishing a little early, which I think is okay, because as you were saying, Jenny, and as we all know, teachers and leaders have been working incredibly hard in this period. So we're going to give them a 5-minute early mark, or we could take some questions from the floor. What do people feel like? I think we've had about 1 billion questions though. Now I've thrown it up in the air. we might wrap it up. And I just want to say thank you everyone for your time tonight. And thanks especially again to Jenny and Anne. Extensive expertise and deep thinking, and just sharing your knowledge and practical advice around literacy in the primary setting, and my colleague Susanna Schofield for her organisation of all of this, and the rest of the team, but mostly thank to our expert panellists. So everyone have a lovely night and keep safe and well, especially those that are currently in lockdown, and take care.